Hello. Welcome to the New Economy Forum at the annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank. I'm Sabina Bhatia of the IMF. Our guest today is Sal Khan, founder and CEO of Khan Academy, a non-profit organization based in California, which provides free online education material for students and teachers from preschool to high school. It has a global reach with over 110 million users and produces content in 46 languages. Hello, Sal. A very warm welcome to you. We are delighted to have you here at our annual meetings.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, Sal, the pandemic has put Khan Academy in the spotlight. You're now a household name, but you were a pioneer in online learning long before the pandemic. How did Khan Academy get started?
Yeah, well, it's a little while ago now. You know, back in 2004, my original background was in tech, and then after business school, I found myself. I was actually an analyst at a hedge fund in Boston, and it just came out of conversation after my wedding in 2004 that my 12-year-old cousin Nadia was having trouble in math, and she was in New Orleans, which is where I was born and raised, and I offered to tutor her remotely, and so we started doing that after work. I would get on the phone and tutor Nadia. And slowly but surely, she got caught up with her class. She got a little bit ahead of her class. At that point, I became what I call a tiger cousin. And I called up her school and I said, I really think Nadia Rahman should be able to retake that placement exam from last year. They said, "Who are you?" I said, "I'm her cousin." And they let her. And the same Nadia who was put into a slower math class and actually was having difficulty in the slower math class was then put into an advanced math class. So I was hooked. It was a fun way for me to connect with family, across the country, and it clearly had some impact on her trajectory. So then I started working with her younger brothers, and over the next year and a half, a word spread in my family that free tutoring was going on. And before I knew it, I had about 10, 15 cousins, family, friends from all over the country who I was tutoring. And with a background in software, I was always curious about making tools. When I was in college, I had written a bunch of software tools for education. I always thought that there was a role that it could play. And I saw my cousins, the reason why they were having trouble, oftentimes in math and sometimes in science and other subjects, it wasn't because they weren't bright. It wasn't because they weren't hardworking. It wasn't because they didn't have great teachers. It was because they had gaps in their knowledge that had accumulated over time. So if you didn't know 20% of, say, basic exponents from 7th grade or 30% of dividing decimals from 5th grade, all of a sudden when you get to algebra class and there's both there, they were having trouble. So I started writing software for them that would help them fill in those gaps. It would generate questions for them. And then I, as their tutor, could keep track of it, seeing what they were finding easy, what they were having difficulty in. And that was the first Khan Academy back in 2005. And then it was in 2006 that a friend at a dinner party, I was showing this off. You can imagine I'm a fun dinner party guest. And he says, "Well, Sal, the software and everything you're doing is really cool, but how are you scaling your lessons?" And I told him, his name's Zulfikar Ramzan. I have to give him full credit. I told him, it's hard to do with 15 cousins what I was originally doing with one. And he said, "Well, why don't you record your lessons as videos and upload them onto YouTube for your family?" And my initial reaction was, that's a horrible idea. YouTube is for cats playing piano. It is not for serious mathematics. But I got over the idea that it was not my idea, and I gave it a shot. And, those videos were just there to supplement the software, this practice software. And I just used YouTube as a place to host it. And I told my cousins, watch this at your own time and pace. That way, when we get on the phone, we can go deeper. And after a month of that, they famously told me they liked me better on YouTube than in person. So I took it as positive feedback, kept going. And they appreciated the real Sal, but they really liked having this on-demand version that was infinitely patient. They had no shame of having to review things from a few years before. And before I knew it, both the software and the videos, many people who are not my cousins were using it. And so by 2009, set it up as a not-for-profit. I frankly had trouble focusing on my day job at that point. And so that's when I quit to try to say, surely the world will conspire to fund this not-for-profit, because the social ROI, return on investment, is really astronomical. And it was a tough year, but by 2010, we had our funding to become a real nonprofit with a mission of a free world-class education for anyone, anywhere.
Excellent. So we're all eternally grateful to Nadia and your cousins. So here we are 7 months into the pandemic, Sal, and many students around the world are doing some sort of virtual learning, some sort of hybrid system. But we know that in-person learning is so much better for students because they need the human connections, the interactions. They can't stay glued to their monitors all day. So how can we make remote learning work better, both for students and for teachers?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. There's remote learning and then there's remote learning during COVID. And there's two different things. Remote learning during COVID, that remote learning for a lot of kids is their main lifeline to a community, to a socialization outside of their direct family. And so the key for remote world learning during COVID, we could brainstorm what the best remote learning is outside of COVID. There's some overlap, is leverage Khan Academy type tools or Khan Academy itself to get the practice, get the feedback, learn things at your own time and pace, get explanations, teachers and parents being able to keep track of things. But you need that synchronous interaction. And because of the constraints of COVID, that has to happen in most cases over video conference. But when you're using video conference, and this is what we've been advocating for, and that's what we've been seeing a lot of teachers do this well, is make it as interactive as possible. Pull kids out of the screen. The way you do that is you ask questions. You put them into virtual breakout sessions. We just did a company offsite for our leadership team, and the facilitator every 10 minutes put us into breakout sessions of 4 people. You can't be disengaged when there's only 3 or 4 people in the room and you have to work on something together. So the teachers who are doing it really well, they're starting with a kind of a fun mixer game to just get kids in the right mood. Close your eyes and draw an elephant and then share your picture just to get them engaged socially. Put them in breakout rooms, try to tackle an interesting question, come back, share it with the group. The teachers can jump between the breakout sessions to help the kids work on whatever problem they're working. You can even differentiate the kids based on what they're ready for. So maybe some of the more precocious kids can be working on harder questions together, or maybe tutoring some of their peers who haven't learned that concept yet. But it's all about making it as interactive as possible and really pulling kids out of the screen.
No, I think you make a good point. I think a lot of that can actually also applies to the workplace, to get people in meetings also to engage and interact. So good lessons there. So we got some interesting feedback on social media. Bhavesh says that online learning can supplement but can't be a substitute for education. Zulkarnain mentioned that the relationship between teachers and student is really important to children. And it's impossible to get that online. And that's consistent with, I think, exactly what you've been saying. So it seems that parents are very concerned about the long-term impact on their children. So I was wondering what your thoughts were on how we can make remote learning sustainable over the long haul, given that the pandemic is here with us for some time now.
Yeah, and just to be clear, on those last 2 comments, I agree with them. No one agrees with them more. I always say if I had to pick between an amazing teacher and amazing technology for my own children, if I had to pick, I would pick the amazing teacher every time. Even if they just have a stick in sand, that's still going to be a better experience than the best artificial intelligence, who knows what, virtual reality. So I always view technology in service to the great teacher and service to what our pedagogical ideals are. And for me, those are all, how do we personalize? How do we reach the student where they are? Because you can imagine when you're one teacher with a class of 30, this is even before COVID, every teacher knows those 30 students have different gaps in their knowledge, different levels of preparedness, different levels of the pace at which they can move forward. And it's not always that certain kids are faster and certain kids are slower. Certain kids are faster in certain concepts, or they might have already been exposed to it. And the only way one teacher with a class of 30 can really address those needs is with some extra help. And that's where we view Khan Academy and tools like it as a really important thing. So it's not technology versus human. And if I had to pick distance versus in person, I would pick in person every time for my own children or for anyone's children. Now, the reason why distance is an important, I would say, piece of or part of the mix is obviously there's COVID type situations where you're just not able to meet. There's just other constraints of being put on you. But there's many examples, students who are refugees, kids who live in rural areas, kids who live in villages, even kids, in many of our kids who might just go to fine schools. There might not be someone at that school that can teach some specialized course that they're really interested in. Or it might be that maybe there is someone at the school who's teaching calculus or biology, but maybe there's a instructor or a modality of instruction that resonates more for that child. So I would never, for my own kids, want to go all the way into 100% distance learning. But I think distance learning has interesting aspects that can be part of the mix, because we know in much of the world, a lot of kids really, they might nominally have access to a physical school, but we know it's incredibly inconsistent. They don't really have access to world-class materials. Sometimes they can't even find someone who can really teach some of these subjects at depth. And that's where the online learning and the distance learning can be really valuable. In terms of your question about, just how do we make sure kids don't fall off the train of learning, so to speak? Yeah, this is what I'm most worried about. I think you have, even in rich countries, you're seeing 20-30% of the population not even having sufficient internet access or devices. Even when you're able to get them, you're having 5-10% of the population that's just not engaged. There's a fifth grade teacher who's one of my neighbors. She's saying, and this is we live in a upper middle class neighborhood. She's saying that, there's 3 or 4 kids in her class of 30. She's just having trouble contacting right now. And you can imagine those were the kids that were already a little bit falling behind. Maybe they don't have the right supports at home. And so she's already seen those kids' vocabulary degrade. They're not able to just engage in school. So this is a really, really big problem, probably exacerbated by the fact that, I think it's, people are talking about a K-shaped recovery when it comes to the economy, that, those with assets, those they're going to be just fine. Those who can do remote work are going to be fine. Those who work in tech are going to be fine, while those who are working in service industries, et cetera, are going to do much worse. Unfortunately, I think COVID is going to do something very similar on the education side. I think, your children, my children, a lot of the folks listening right now, they're going to be fine. It's not perfect for them either. It's hard for them, but, they're going to better resource schools. They have digital device access. They have support structures at home that are making sure that they stay engaged. There's just a lot of supports that are working for, I would say, the upper half of kids, at least financially, but that especially that bottom 20-30%, they're going to be in a tough situation. And what we're trying to do at Khan Academy is, one, on the Khan Academy level, do as much work as we can so that we can not lose as many of these kids as possible this year. In a normal year, we always talk about how do we improve outcomes. This year is a year where we're talking about how do we not lose kids. And then how do we advocate for models of distance learning or hybrid learning that are truly engaging? And then when everyone does come back to school physically, how do we do the reconstruction work? It's almost like after you've gone through a war and you need to rebuild the buildings. I think there's going to be that type of work that's necessary in the school system globally.
Yeah. No, I think you make a good point. And as you know, at the IMF, we're very concerned also about the long-term scarring effects on the economy and, especially on students, because they're the future. So yes, indeed, it is extremely worrisome. So we took a poll on social media asking people what the greatest challenge was to distance learning. And unsurprisingly, on Twitter, 45% said it was internet connection and 31% said it was cost affordability. And the two, of course, are related, as you know. So I guess my question is, how do we deal with the digital divide, both in the US, but also more generally in the developing world, where it's a bigger issue? And UNICEF, for instance, says that 500 million students worldwide don't have access to remote learning.
Yeah, well, I just reminded myself that I'm talking to the IMF. So, everything y'all do is, what are large-scale projects that can really uplift the productive capacity of a people, of a country? And I honestly, at this phase of where we are as a civilization, I mean, dams are great and roads are great and electrical infrastructure is great. But COVID has put a huge spotlight on just how important having digital access and at home is in some way, shape, or form. So in the U.S., I've been very vocal that, in the U.S. we've been putting, I think we've already done $2 trillion of stimulus, to get the remaining 20 or 30% of U.S. families who do not have sufficient internet access. We're talking on the order, my back of the envelope is maybe 10 or $20 billion, which is, a very small fraction of $2 trillion. We're talking on the order of 1%. And, I think for other countries and other places, it's a larger fraction of, say, GDP or what they're able to do in terms of stimulus or the annual budget. But I've got to believe that any way you cut it, I mean, I'm sure people are doing economic studies on this. The social return on investment is very, very high, and it's not just because of access to things like Khan Academy. And look, once you can access Khan Academy, I can share, some social return on investment things we've done using fairly rigorous analysis. And Khan Academy has we're a budget of a large high school. We have an annual budget of about 60 million a year. We reach over 100 million kids, so we have a social return on investment of about 1,000 to 1. For every dollar put in, there's $1,000 of social impact, at least. And that actually, these are very conservative. But to be able to access that, you have to have some basic internet access, whether it's on a cellular device or whether it's a landline, some kind of land, cable, fiber, whatever. So it's not just being able to access that, but it unlocks economic opportunities. Frankly, right now, just to be mentally connected, socially, emotionally connected to humanity, you need that to be able to look for jobs. I mean, when we talk about structural unemployment, the people who don't have sufficient internet connection, they're going to be more structurally unemployed because of that. So I think it's, I'm shouting from the rooftops that I think there's no higher social ROI infrastructure project that you can have in pretty much anywhere in the world than figuring out how to get everyone internet access. I hope Elon Musk's Starlink works. That might simplify things dramatically. You might be able to get internet in the middle of the desert. But yeah, I'd love to brainstorm with all of y'all on how we can do that.
Okay, just turning a little bit away from distance learning to more generally on education. In developing countries, the situation is even more dire than what you've described in the US and elsewhere, where digital access is the main challenge. As more families are thrown into poverty in developing countries, they're sending their children to earn a living. So we're seeing an increase in child labor. According to UNESCO, more than 1.6 billion learners worldwide have been affected by school university closures. Many of these kids will not get back to the classrooms, and with girls especially at high risk of dropping out. So just your thoughts, Sal, what you think can be done, not just necessarily only by Khan Academy, but more generally people in education and public policy, to ensure that we don't create a COVID generation whose opportunities are permanently damaged?
Well, I think it does gel into what we just talked about. What you've talked about is very unfortunate. And we know even before COVID, that's always been a dynamic that kids are, even sometimes 10, 11 years old, and the family needs them to make money or doesn't see the value in them continuing their education. Unfortunately, this is disproportionately happening for young women. I think, obviously, the more that we can educate families on the importance of their kids staying in the system, the better. But while we do that, I think it's also a good idea to create parallel structures so that it doesn't feel as either or for the families. So, for example, during COVID, I've been telling everyone, look, if your child is able to put in even an hour and a half a day, say 30, 40 minutes a day of deliberate practice in math, 30, 40 minutes a day of real deliberate practice with reading comprehension and writing, that's just an hour and a half, 2 hours a day. The resources exist. Khan Academy can deliver this to any, there's 46 translation projects of Khan Academy around the world. So on math and science, we already have that covered. It's already there. And in the humanities or in reading comprehension, it's not a far leap to be able to do that as well. And so even in these unfortunate situations where a young girl is forced to work at home or a young boy is forced to go work someplace, if we can just say, hey, hour and a half a day, 2 hours a day, stay engaged, maybe even create incentives for the family, some baseline financial incentives. If your son or daughter is able to do at least an hour a day, even half an hour a day on some of these platforms, which you can measure at a provincial or even at a statewide or nationwide level, you'll get some added benefits to it. I think there could also be really valuable to have what I would call competency-based credentialing structures. Most of the education system is based on, I guess you could say, seat time. You sit 40 hours a week for 12 years, 16 years, and we give you a diploma, and we can debate how valuable that is. But instead we say, look, if you can show mastery in this, we'll recognize it. And that's all you need to get this type of job or to get this type of, get into higher education. And so that also provides an outlet for people who kind of fall off the train and want to get back on, but the train has already left. They say, okay, I just need to figure out a path where I can master that subject. And once again, that's where things like Khan Academy are really valuable. There's another related project, and this goes into everything we've talked about, called schoolhouse.world, which is another nonprofit that I've been starting that's complementary to Khan Academy, but it does two things, and it's along these lines. It pairs kids who need tutoring with people who are willing to give that tutoring. And it's really a peer-to-peer model where what we're doing is, once the student is able to learn the concepts through Khan Academy and through the tutoring on Schoolhouse, we then encourage them to certify themselves, to show that they actually know it. And the way they take it, they have to show that, they just have to take a video of themselves explaining while they take a test that we generate for them, which they can take as many times as they need because it doesn't repeat questions. And then once they get certified, then they become a tutor. And then a tutor, if you can tutor a subject, that's even a higher level of certification. You clearly know the subject matter, but then obviously that creates capacity to help other folks. Mm-hmm. So we would love to work with, the schoolhouse.world project in theory could scale to nations or internationally.
Interesting. I really like your competency-based model and this whole notion of a growth mindset. I think that's really interesting. So just I mentioned to you that this week are our annual meetings, where we have our virtual annual meetings with our ministers of finance and central bank governors. Let's say you were an advisor to these ministers and central bank governors, and you had to give them an advice, call to action. I'm sure you'd say digital access, but what else would you say if you could recommend one or two policy items for them?
Yeah, and my old hedge fund hat starts immediately thinking about monetary policy. I think everyone has that covered. I think everyone knows we need a very liquid environment right now. I think on the policy side, we talked a lot about digital divide. I think being able to create competency-based models within your country, and obviously it's not just going to be the finance minister that does that, but the finance minister in conjunction with the with the equivalent of the Chamber of Commerce, or in combination with the education minister, to be able to create these competency-based systems. I think also frankly, just promote that Khan Academy exists. It's free. It's not for profit. It's available in probably most of the countries that, in most of the languages that most of the people are watching there's a fully Spanish Khan Academy, fully Brazilian Portuguese. We have Khan Academy in at least 8 languages of the Indian subcontinent. And there's 40 something other, linguistic versions of Khan Academy around the world. So at least in math and in actually a lot of the sciences, we already have you covered, but the issue is a lot of people don't even know it exists in a lot of these countries. And so we just need to help promote. And then the ideal is you can promote, you can say, hey, this is the free tutor that every child in the country now has. It's a huge political win. If I was a politician, how many times can you tell someone, hey, we have something awesome for you that has real value that you can use right now for your children. And then if you could create mechanisms that if you get mastery on Khan Academy, or if you get certified on Schoolhouse, that can then lead to a credential. And then if you can show mastery in A, B, or C, these employers will take a very serious look at it. So, convene the private sector to say, if someone's able to show mastery in algebra, that shows something. That in some ways, you can find people who get high school diplomas and college diplomas, but you really don't know whether they've mastered algebra. So things like that, I think, could go a long way. And obviously just giving access at home.
Yeah. Good, excellent. I did check out the Hindi pages on Khan Academy. So, so just one final question before I turn to audience questions. How do you think the pandemic will alter the future of education? What does the new normal in your world look like?
Yeah, none of us know, but I suspect, some of the things that we've been talking about pre-COVID, that learning should not be bound by time or space, mastery, competency-based learning we've talked about today, the notion of personalization, that the education should meet the student where they are, instead of the student having to somehow stay on the treadmill of wherever the education is. These have been principles we've always talked about. The idea that learning should not be bound by time or space has become a necessity during COVID. I think personalization is going to become an increasing necessity because kids are going to have even more variance in their capabilities. So they're going to need more personalized ways to fill in those gaps. I think the competency-based learning, University of Chicago, a major university in the US, announced last week, they're going to use our certification for college admissions in a year where it's been very inconsistent on how you can even assess or even what your grades are. So I think a lot of these trends are useful even after COVID. So I think they'll persist. I think you have a whole generation of teachers who've been thrown into the deep end of the pool with technology. It's been very uncomfortable. It's been hard. I empathize with them, but they're going to be more comfortable with technology after this. I think video conference and these debates about how do you make it more engaging, a lot of the stuff we've been talking about pulling people out of the screen, these also matter when you're in person together. So I think it's going to change instruction generally. I think you're going to see a lot more classes where if you're sick or your family's going on a trip, that you're going to still be able to engage with your classroom because the teacher's going to feel comfortable having 4 or 5 kids on Zoom while the other 25 kids are in the classroom. I mean, we're already seeing that, obviously. So that I think is going to become the norm, that even if you're not there present, you can always still participate in school, which is be pretty cool. I think you're going to see more energy than ever divide. I'd like to believe that's going to be a silver lining. You have a whole generation of parents who are frankly more involved in their education than ever before. And you have a whole generation of students who've had to take more responsibility. You know, I worry once again that there's some kids who might not have been able to make the leap, but a lot of kids have. The leap of taking more responsibility for themselves. And actually, I think that's going to pay dividends as they go into college and beyond.
Okay, thanks for that, Sal. So just turning to the questions that we got on social media, we got one question from Yohani, who commented that there's a lack of prestige associated with online courses and degrees. And he says that online on-campus should be considered equal. In a sense, they both carry equal merit. Tan says that employers don't accept online certificates. So what do you think, Sal? Is it really the same to get an online degree versus an in-person on-campus merits?
So I'll say it's different. I mean, this whole conversation has made us unpack what an education is. You know, when you go to a 4-year university, you're learning a certain set of skills. I'd argue most of those skills you actually can learn online. Some of them, the lab skills or the hands-on, you know, we can debate ways that you can do that online or distance learning, but most of the skills, you know, accounting, learning to program a computer, these things you can do online. But what you realize universities do 2 other things. They do credentialing, and that's, you know, the first comment that, you know, what is a signal worth, that signal of competence. And then they also do their social community. And, you know, a lot of what I really valued about my own college experience was, you know, the late night conversations in the dorm rooms, meeting friends at dining hall. I met my wife in college, so, you know, that's priceless. So there's other things that obviously I don't think that would have happened with distance learning. So what I see happening, and I think the other notion is online, it's kind of I would say maybe the more for-profit world has kind of gone deeper in online, and I would say the traditional universities have been a little bit more cautious, although they're getting a little bit more, they're leaning into it more now. And so that's where I think you've seen a little bit of a reputational delta between the two. I think the world you're getting to, especially, you know, is where you're going to have very credible paths that happen online that are not an either or. They could be an or, they could be an and. With in person. You know, I'll give an example. Google, for example, they have a Google certification system that if you go through it, it takes like 6 months. But if you go through it, they view you as in the same pool as a Stanford and MIT grad with a computer science degree. And if Google is willing to hire people and view you in the same pool as some of the top graduates in the world, then that's starting to say something. And if you think about it, it really is a competency-based system. Amazon is doing something similar where if you can, they're doing these online assessments, and if you can pass that assessment, they don't care if or where you went to school or what your degree is. You're in the pool with the top graduates with computer science degrees. Once again, these are some of the most aspirational employers in the world. So I think you're starting to see that happen. And obviously one of the things that, you know, I really want to work on, and COVID is accelerating my energy here, is creating really reputable competency-based signals that students can do to take to higher education, to take to employers, and people say, oh yeah, that's really good. I'm going to give that student a chance. And I think that's going to be a huge leveler of the playing field. So when we ask what finance ministers could do, or central bank chiefs, I think it's also that convening power with industry and say, okay, let's come up with some competency-based signals. and let's all agree, let's hold hands and say, yeah, we'll give people internships with that, we'll give them entry level jobs, and then hold yourself accountable. Are those people really not as good as the person who went to college?
And then we got another bucket of questions on the mix of poverty and online education. So I'll group them. So one teacher from Ektara school in Kolkata, India asked, it's difficult for children to learn when their parents aren't educated enough to assist them. Others talk about the fact that poor children don't have a quiet, comfortable space to learn. This is a universal, I think, issue across different countries. And Kamar Hussain puts it very poignantly. He says, how can you learn when you are surrounded by the pressure of poverty all day? He calls it a lingering disease in the back of your mind. And so, Sal, I'm just wondering, schools give these children a reprieve from the poverty and hardship so that for a few hours a day, at least, they can be kids and learn. Mm-hmm. So what's going to happen to these children, and what do you think we can do to help?
Yeah, this is not a simple thing, and I agree with every commenter. I think this is probably the central question. And as everyone knows, even when you do have schools, it's the school isn't 24 hours, so these kids are always at kind of a bit of a disadvantage, even if their schools are great. And we know in some cases they're not given the same schools that your or my children might have. And during COVID, we've seen some school systems do what they do is they do distance learning because they have to because of COVID. But what they do is they open up the schools and they bring in the 5 or 10 or 20% of children who need the support, who need the food, the lunch program or the breakfast program, the kids whose parents might not be there to support them, who might not have internet access at home. And they're, in a socially distanced, safe way, they are watched over by some adults who aren't even the teachers are still doing distance learning, but their teachers are at home doing the distance learning, while those kids are able to use the school's facilities, the school's computers, the school's air conditioners, whatever, to be able to engage properly in learning. And that, to me, feels, if a school system or a school can do that, that feels like a very compelling solution right now for the next 6 to 8 months as we go through this, as we go through the school year. Longer term, I've always been a big believer of full year, full day schooling. Our current school hours and school year is it's really based on an agrarian calendar in Western countries when, mass public education was first adopted in the 18th and 19th centuries. And it assumes, mom at home with apple pie ready at 2 p.m. And, and that's not the reality anywhere in the world. And so, we started a lab school, Lab School, 6 years ago here, and it goes year round. The longest break is 2 weeks, and the school day ends at 6. And you might say that sounds draconian, all this, but it's actually because you have the longer school day, it allows the kids to finish what would traditionally be homework while they're in school, while they're in a safe, supporting setting. They can have their peers to help them, and that way, when they get home, they can focus on being at home, having dinner with their family, talking to their family, et cetera, and getting enough sleep, which is also another important thing.
Yeah, all good thoughts. And on that happy note, I'd just like to thank you, Sal, for the great resources that Khan Academy provides us in these difficult times. And thank you for joining the IMF and World Bank for our annual meetings and for this conversation. Thank you.
No, honored to be part of this. Thank you so much.